The law of the prairie is simple. You trust your own, and you fear the rest. But for a young widow named Sarah Carter, a single act of compassion would shatter that law forever. When she dragged a dying Apache warrior from the dust and into the shelter of her barn, she thought she was hiding a secret. She was wrong. That night, as 100 torches burned a ring of fire around her isolated homestead, she learned her secret wasn't just a man. It was a truth powerful enough to burn the whole corrupt town of Harmony Creek to the ground. The dust was a living thing on the plains of the Arizona Territory. It coated Sarah Carter's tongue, settled in the lines around her eyes, and clung to the black mourning dress she had long since stopped caring about. It was the same dust that had claimed her husband Thomas, not in a swift, clean moment of violence, but in a slow, choking embrace of consumption that had left him a hollowed-out shell of the man she married. Now, the dust and the silence were her only companions on the quarter section of land that felt less like a home and more like a tombstone marking the grave of her dreams. Her life was a metronome of chores, each swing a predictable, lonely beat. Sunrise milk the goat, tend the meager garden. Midday, mend the fences, clear the brush. Sunset, stare at the horizon and watch the sky bleed into the same bruised purples that she saw when she closed her eyes. It was a life of subsistence, not of living. The nearby town of Harmony Creek was a place she visited only when necessity screamed louder than her grief. It was a town built on hard men and harder judgments where a lone woman was a curiosity at best and a target at worst. This afternoon, the heat was a physical weight pressing down with a suffocating intensity. A shimmer of haze distorted the distant mesas, making them tremble like ghosts. As Sarah hauled a bucket of water from the well, a flicker of movement near the cottonwood grove at the edge of her property snagged her attention. It wasn't the familiar lope of a coyote or the skittering of a jackrabbit. This was different. Slower. Heavier. Her hand instinctively went to the small of her back, where the cold, reassuring weight of the Colt Peacemaker Thomas had insisted she learn to use rested in its holster. She set the bucket down, her heart beginning a low, anxious thrum against her ribs. She moved with a caution born of solitude, her boots making soft scuffs in the dirt. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a man crawling, an Indian, an Apache. His body was a canvas of suffering. His buckskin leggings were torn and stained dark with what could only be blood. One leg dragged uselessly behind him, leaving a shallow, pathetic trench in the dirt. His back was a landscape of raw, weeping wounds, as if he'd been dragged over rock and cactus. He was dying. She could see it in the rasping, shallow breaths that barely stirred the dust beneath his face. Every instinct, every whispered warning from the folks in town screamed at her. Danger. Savage. Killer. The stories they told in the Harmony Creek saloon were tales of brutality, of raids and scalpings. The Apache were specters of the wilderness, the embodiment of the unforgiving nature of this land. The town's formidable marshal Jedediah Kane had built his reputation on the number of Apache bounties he'd collected. To be caught helping one was not just a crime, it was treason against your own kind. She raised the Colt, the barrel steady, despite the tremor in her hands. The man's head lifted, and his eyes met hers. They were black, bottomless pits of pain, but in their depths she saw something else. Not malice, not hatred. It was a flicker of exhausted defiance, a spark of a spirit that refused to be extinguished even as the body failed. He said nothing. his lips cracked and caked with dried blood. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. It would be so easy. An act of self-preservation. A mercy, even. The desert would claim his body, and no one would ever know. It would be one less threat in a world teeming with them. She thought of Marshal Kane's flinty eyes, of the smug, satisfied smiles of the men who spat tobacco juice on the boardwalk, and spoke of Indians as if they were vermin. Then she thought of Thomas. He had been a doctor, a man of science and compassion. You don't get to choose who is worthy of healing, Sarah, he used to say, his gentle hands sorting through his medical supplies. The pain is the same, no matter the skin it's in. He had believed in a world that was better than the one they lived in, a belief that had ultimately seemed as fragile as his own lungs. The Apache's eyes fluttered closed. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound agony that it cut through Sarah's fear like a knife. In that moment, he was not a savage, not a threat. He was simply a dying man, alone in the dust miles from anyone who would mourn him, just like her. "Damn you, Thomas." She whispered the words, a raw tear in the silence. "Damn you for being a good man." The Colt felt impossibly heavy. Slowly, she lowered it, returning it to its holster. The decision once made settled in her with a terrifying clarity. She was crossing a line, and she knew there would be no going back. The man was heavier than he looked. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his, her own small frame, straining with the effort. His skin was fever-hot, his body radiating a dry, furnace-like heat. She dragged him inch by painful inch across the yard. His good leg scrabbled for purchase, trying to help, but the effort only seemed to deepen his agony. The trail he left was a smear of blood and disturbed earth, a clear and damning signpost pointing directly to her barn. The barn was her sanctuary, the one place that still smelled of Thomas of hay and leather, and the faint, clean scent of the soap he used. It felt like a violation to bring the violence of the world into this space, but the house was too risky. The windows were too open, too exposed. She hauled him into the cool, dim interior, the scent of dried alfalfa and dust motes dancing in the shafts of light piercing the gloom. She eased him down onto a pile of old burlap sacks in an empty horse stall, his head lolling to the side. For a moment, she stood over him, her chest heaving, the enormity of her actions crashing down on her. She had taken in a serpent, a creature the world had told her to despise and destroy. She had hidden him in the heart of her home. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood. She knew that darkness would bring its own terrors, but as she looked at the broken man lying in her barn, she realized the real darkness was not in the approaching night, but in the hearts of the men who would hunt him. And she had just declared war on them all. The first hour was a frantic ballet of quiet desperation. Sarah moved with a purpose she hadn't felt since Thomas's final days, her grief momentarily eclipsed by the immediacy of the task. First, she used a rake to obliterate the bloody trail leading to the barn, scattering fresh dirt and hay over the incriminating path until it looked like nothing more than the everyday scuffs and scrapes of ranch life. Each pass of the rake was a prayer, a plea for invisibility. Returning to the barn, she found the Apache warrior, whose name she did not know, drifting in and out of consciousness. His fever was a raging fire. She fetched the medical bag Thomas had left behind, its leather cracked and worn, but its contents still holding the ghost of his healing touch. It felt both sacrilegious and right to use it for this man. She lit a single lantern, keeping the flame low, casting long, dancing shadows that made the barn feel both immense and claustrophobic. She worked by its flickering light, her hands surprisingly steady. With a pair of shears, she cut away the tattered buckskin from his back. The wounds were worse than she'd first thought. They were deep gouges, inflamed, and angry, filled with dirt and splinters of cactus spine. It wasn't a whipping. It looked as though he'd been dragged behind a horse. A punishment. A message. She cleaned the wounds as gently as she could with carbolic soap and water. The man hissed in pain, his body tensing, but he did not cry out. When she probed for a particularly deep splinter with a pair of tweezers, his hand shot out and gripped her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, a coil of steel despite his weakness. His eyes, blazing with fever, locked onto hers. Nakai. He rasped the name, a dry whisper, like leaves skittering across stone. It was the first word he'd spoken. Sarah, she replied, her voice soft. My name is Sarah Carter. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent, primal assessment. Then, as if satisfied by what he saw, he released her. The tension left his body, and he surrendered to her care, his breathing still ragged, but a fraction less strained. His name was Nakai. Giving him a name made him real, made the secret she was keeping heavier, more substantial. As she worked, she studied him. He was younger than she had first guessed, perhaps her own age or a little older. The harsh lines of his face were drawn by pain, not just years. Beneath the grime and blood, his features were strong, defined by high cheekbones and a proud aquiline nose. A small, intricately beaded amulet hung around his neck, half hidden in the matted black hair that fell across his chest. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own in the lantern light. She bandaged his back with clean strips of linen torn from an old bedsheet. Then she turned to his leg. The bone was clearly broken, a jagged end threatening to pierce the skin just below the knee. A compound fracture. Without a doctor to set it properly, he would be crippled for life if infection didn't claim him first. She did the only thing she could. She fashioned a crude splint from 2 flat pieces of wood from a broken crate and bound it tightly, immobilizing the limb. He bore the procedure with a stoicism that shamed her own fears. When she was finished, she brought him water in a dipper. He drank greedily, spilling some down his chin. He looked at her again, a flicker of gratitude in his dark eyes. He was a man, she thought, not a monster. A man pushed to the very edge of his existence. Her chores had been forgotten. The sun had long set, and the goat was bleating indignantly from its pen. As she finally left the barn and headed for the small house, a shape emerged from the gloom. Evening Sarah. She jumped, her hand flying to the colt at her back. Silas Blackwood stood by her porch, a silhouette against the starry sky, holding a burlap sack. He was a wiry old prospector who lived a few miles down the creek, her nearest neighbor. He had always been kind to her since Thomas's death, stopping by with a freshly caught rabbit or a piece of news from town, his watery blue eyes always holding a look of paternal concern. Tonight, however, his presence felt like a threat. "Silas," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "You startled me." "Didn't mean to," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Was in town today. Picked up some flour for you. Figured it'd save you the trip." He held out the sack. "Heard some commotion, too. Marshal Kane and his boys rode out this morning. Tracking a renegade Apache, they said. A real mean one. Caused a whole mess of trouble up north." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Oh," she said, taking the sack. Her hands felt numb. "They don't usually come this far south." "Well, this one did," Silas said, his eyes scanning her property, lingering for a moment on the barn. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Had he seen something? Did the raked earth look suspicious? Kane's offering a hefty bounty, $200, enough to make a man risk his hide. He squinted at her. "You look peaky, Sarah. Everything all right out here? You're all alone after all. A body worries." "I'm fine, Silas. Just tired," she said, forcing a small smile. "The heat takes it out of you." "That it does." He nodded, though his gaze was still sharp, probing. "Well, you holler if you need anything. Anything at all. A gunshot in the night, I'll come running." "Thank you, Silas. I appreciate it." He tipped his dusty hat and ambled back toward the creek, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah stood frozen on her porch, the flour sack clutched in her hands. Silas's visit meant as a kindness had been a warning. The world was closing in. $200 was a fortune. It was enough to turn a good neighbor into a bounty hunter. It was enough to get her killed. She returned to the house and bolted the door, something she rarely did. She couldn't eat. Her mind raced, replaying Silas's words. Tracking a renegade Apache. That was Nakai. Marshal Kane was hunting him. And now Silas, the kind, fatherly old man, knew something was afoot. He was a creature of the plains, a man who could read the land like a book. He would have noticed the faintest sign of a disturbance. Late into the night, she sat at her kitchen table. The unlit lamp before her, listening to the sounds of the prairie. Every rustle of the wind in the mesquite, every distant yip of a coyote, sounded like the hoofbeats of approaching riders. The secret in her barn was no longer just a dying man. It was a $200 bounty, a symbol of everything the town of Harmony Creek feared and hated. And it was her secret to keep a weight that pressed down on her with the force of 1,000 tons of rock and dust. She thought of the amulet around Nakai's neck. It seemed too personal, too intricate for a simple warrior. Who was he? Why was Marshal Kane so determined to hunt him down? The questions swirled in the darkness, offering no answers, only a deepening sense of dread. She had chosen her path, and now she could only walk it one terrifying step at a time. The next day dawned heavy and oppressive, the air thick with unspoken threats. Sarah moved through her morning chores in a fog of anxiety, her senses stretched to their breaking point. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered accusation. Every shadow seemed to hold the form of a man on horseback. She took a bowl of thin corn mush and a canteen of fresh water to the barn, her movements swift and furtive. Nakai was awake. The fever still held him in its grip, but the lucidity in his eyes was stronger. He ate the mush slowly, his gaze fixed on her. The silence between them was thick, but not empty. It was a space of shared vulnerability, of a trust forged in the crucible of desperation. Using gestures, a combination of pointed fingers and crudely drawn shapes in the dirt floor of the stall, she tried to ask him what had happened. She drew a horse, then a man dragging another man. Nakai's face hardened. He nodded slowly. Then he picked up a small stone and tapped it against another, the sound sharp and rhythmic. He pointed to his own chest, then held up 10 fingers twice. 20. Then he made a shape of a man with a star on his chest. A lawman. Marshal Kane. And 20 men. They hadn't just beaten him. They had made a sport of it. A calculated act of cruelty. But why? Before she could press further, a sound reached them from the distance. Hoofbeats, not one rider, but many. Coming fast. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She scrambled to the barn door, peering through a small crack in the weathered wood. A plume of dust was rising from the direction of Harmony Creek, a tan-colored serpent uncoiling against the bright blue sky. It was a posse, and they were heading straight for her ranch. "They're coming!" She breathed, her voice a knot of panic. She turned back to Nakai. His expression was grim but calm. He had been expecting this. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, his back against the stall wall, his face a mask of resolute pain. He reached inside his tattered buckskin shirt and pulled out a long, wicked-looking knife that she hadn't seen before. It was his only weapon. "You must go," he said, his voice low and guttural. "They will not harm a white woman." "They will if they find you here." She countered, her mind racing. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide him. The land around her ranch was flat and open, offering no cover. The barn was a trap. The sound of the riders grew louder, a thunderous drumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the barn. She could hear the jingle of harnesses, the creak of leather, the coarse shouts of men. She ran back to the house, her mind a whirlwind of fear. She had to appear normal, unsuspecting. She grabbed a basket of mending and sat on her porch rocker, her hands trembling so badly she could barely thread the needle. She forced herself to breathe, to slow the frantic beating of her heart. They poured into her yard like a flood. It wasn't 20 men. It was more. 50, 60, maybe more. A sea of grim-faced riders, their horses sweating and stomping their eyes hard. They were farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers. The men she saw in town, their faces now twisted with a righteous fury. And at their head, riding a magnificent black stallion, was Marshal Jedediah Kane. Kane was a man carved from the harsh rock of the territory. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick graying moustache and eyes the color of a winter sky. A silver star was pinned to his leather vest, but it was his aura of absolute, unyielding authority that truly marked him as the law. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his spurs jingling a deathly little song on the hard-packed earth. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a low baritone that carried an implicit threat. He swept off his hat, a gesture that was more mockery than respect. "A good morning to you," Marshal Sarah replied, her voice tight. She remained seated, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "We're on the hunt," Kane announced, his gaze sweeping over her property, lingering on the barn with an unnerving intensity. "Tracking an Apache murderer. Goes by the name Nakai. Killed a family up by the Verde River. We tracked him this way. The trail went cold about 2 miles east of here." Sarah's blood turned to ice. A murderer. Was that who she was protecting? She looked at the faces of the men behind Kane. Their expressions were a mixture of fear and bloodlust fueled by the Marshal's words. "I haven't seen anyone, Marshal," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Kane smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "Is that so, my best tracker?" "A man by the name of Silas Blackwood seems to think otherwise." From the back of the posse, Silas emerged, his face a portrait of conflicted misery. He wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes. "Silas." Sarah whispered the betrayal, a sharp, physical blow. "Tell her what you told me," Old Man Kane commanded. Silas shuffled his feet, his gaze fixed on the ground. I saw a drag trail yesterday near the creek marshal, he mumbled. Looked like a body had been hauled, headed this way. I came by last night to check on Sarah. She seemed spooked. Kane's smile widened. He took a step closer to the porch, his presence looming over her. Spooked, you say? A lone woman on a desolate ranch looking spooked, and now a drag trail leading right to her doorstep. You see, Mrs. Carter, the pieces start to fit together. You're harboring him, aren't you? That's a crazy accusation. Sarah shot back a surge of defiant anger, cutting through her fear. Is it? Kane's voice dropped, becoming silky and dangerous. We all know your late husband had peculiar sympathies, a man who believed in treating their kind like they were human. Perhaps that sentiment rubbed off on you. He let the insinuation hang in the air, thick and poisonous. He was not just accusing her of a crime. He was condemning her with the memory of her husband's compassion. He turned to his men. He's in the barn, Kane declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. The renegade is in that barn. Some of you spread out. Surround the place. Make sure there's no way out. The posse moved with a chilling efficiency, their earlier chaotic energy now focused into a single deadly purpose. They formed a wide, menacing circle around the barn, their rifles held at the ready. Sarah was trapped, her small ranch transformed into a siege ground. Kane turned back to her, his face a mask of righteous authority. I'll give you one chance, Mrs. Carter. For the sake of your late husband's memory, I will be merciful. You bring the savage out now, and I will see to it that the judge goes easy on you. You defy me, and I'll burn that barn to the ground with him inside it. The sun beat down on the tense tableau. Sarah looked from Kane's implacable face to the circle of armed men, their forms shimmering in the heat. She looked at the closed door of her barn, where a man named Nakai waited with nothing but a knife against a tidal wave of hatred. They called him a murderer, but she had seen his eyes. She had cleaned his wounds, and she had seen the marshal's smile. In the stark, unforgiving light of the Arizona sun, she knew she was standing between two kinds of savagery, and she had to choose which one she would fight. As dusk began to settle, casting long skeletal shadows across the yard, the siege took on a hellish, almost festive quality. The men of the posse, their initial tension giving way to a restless, liquor-fueled impatience, had lit torches. Not just a few, but dozens. 100 points of flickering orange light that encircled the barn, holding back the encroaching darkness and painting the scene in the colors of damnation. The air grew thick with the smell of pine tar and whiskey. Laughter, coarse and brutal, punctuated the low murmur of the mob. Sarah remained on her porch, a solitary figure in a rocking chair, the shotgun resting across her lap. She had become a statue of defiance, her presence a silent rebuke to the chaos unfolding in her yard. She had refused to move, refused to speak further with Marshal Kane, who now stood near the main barn door, directing his men with the cool confidence of a wolf leading a pack. Inside the barn, the heat from the torches began to seep through the wooden planks, raising the temperature in the already stuffy air. The light from the flames pierced the cracks, striping the darkness with pulsating bars of orange. Nakai had dragged himself to the center of the barn, away from the walls. He sat with his back against a support beam, the long knife resting on his splintered leg. His face, illuminated by the hellish glow, was calm. It was the terrifying calm of a man who had accepted his fate. He had watched Sarah through a knothole as she faced Kane. He had seen her refuse to yield. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her courage. It was a courage that shamed his own weariness. Outside, a young deputy named Finn Riley shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He was barely 20, his face still holding the softness of youth, a stark contrast to the leathery, sun-beaten faces of the other men. He had joined the marshal's service to uphold the law, to be a force for order, not to be part of a lynch mob. He looked at Sarah Carter, sitting alone on her porch, then at the ring of fire, and then at the triumphant sneer on Marshal Kane's face. A knot of doubt, cold and hard, was tightening in his stomach. Marshal Finn said, approaching Kane cautiously, "Are you sure about this burning the barn? What if he's not even in there? We'll have destroyed this woman's property for nothing." Kane turned his cold eyes on the deputy. "He's in there, boy. I can smell him. And she's made her choice. She chose to side with a filthy savage over her own people. The barn is the price she pays." "But it's not right," Finn insisted, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't justice." Justice, Kane scoffed, is a bullet in the head of any man or woman who stands in the way of progress. Now get back in line before I decide you've got peculiar sympathies of your own. The threat was clear. Finn retreated, his face pale, his conscience at war with his fear. Kane strode toward the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped 10 feet from Sarah, the firelight catching the cruel glint in his eyes. "Last chance, Mrs. Carter," he boomed, his voice carrying over the crackle of the torches. "The sun is down. My patience is gone. Give him up." Sarah's gaze was unwavering. "The only savage I see out here." "Marshal," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is you." A murmur went through the posse. A woman, a widow, speaking with such venom to the most powerful man in the county. Kane's face darkened with rage. "So be it," he snarled. He turned to his men. "Light it up! Burn it down!" Several men, emboldened by the command, ran forward with their torches, heading for the dry, weathered wood of the barn. This was it, the final moment. But just as the first torch was about to touch the wall, a voice cut through the air, sharp and desperate. "Wait!" It was Silas Blackwood. He stumbled forward from the crowd, his face ashen in the firelight. He looked from Kane to Sarah, his expression one of pure agony. "What is it?" Old man Kane snapped, furious at the interruption. "Don't do it, Marshal," Silas pleaded, his voice cracking. There's something you should know." He took a deep breath, his eyes finally meeting Sarah's. In them, she saw not betrayal, but a terrible, wrenching guilt. The Apache. Nakai. He ain't the one who killed that family. A hush fell over the posse. All eyes turned to Silas. Kane's hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. "What did you say? I was up on the Verde last week, prospecting." Silas said the words tumbling out of him in a rush. "I saw it. It wasn't no Apache raid. It was white men, dressed up like Indians. They wanted that family's land, the water rights. I saw them. I was too scared to do anything. I ran. But I recognized one of them." He lifted a trembling hand and pointed not at a member of the posse, but straight at the marshal. "I recognized him." Silas cried, his voice breaking. It was Kane. Marshal Kane led them. The world seemed to stop. The crackling of the torches was the only sound. Sarah stared, her mind reeling. Cain. A murderer. The man who accused Nakai was the true killer. Cain's face was a mask of disbelief, which quickly melted into pure fury. He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. The truth was written in the sudden, violent tightening of his jaw. "You senile old fool," Cain hissed, and in a single fluid motion, he drew his Colt and fired. The gunshot ripped through the night. Silas Blackwood crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. Screams erupted from the posse. The festive atmosphere shattered, replaced by shock and horror. They had come to lynch an Apache, not to witness the cold-blooded murder of one of their own by the marshal himself. In that moment of chaos and confusion, Sarah knew it was her only chance. Nakai. She screamed, leaping from the porch and running toward the side of the barn, away from Cain. Now, as if he had been waiting for her signal, the smaller side door of the barn burst open. Nakai emerged, not charging, but moving with a limping, desperate urgency. He used a long plank of wood as a crutch, his face a grimace of pain. Cain, his pistol still smoking, turned to see them. A look of pure, unadulterated hatred contorted his features. He raised his gun, ignoring the panicked shouts of his own men, and aimed it at the fleeing figures of the widow and the Apache. This was the twist. The night was no longer about prejudice and mob justice. It was about a desperate cover-up, a secret far darker than the one Sarah had been hiding in her barn. The flames of the torches no longer seemed to be encircling a monster, but a man who held the truth. And that truth had just cost one man his life and was about to set the entire prairie on fire. The world dissolved into a cacophony of shouts, gunfire, and the roar of nascent flame as one of the torches, dropped by a startled rider, caught on a patch of dry grass near the barn wall. The murder of Silas Blackwood had been a stone tossed into a stagnant pond, and the ripples were turning into a tidal wave of chaos. The posse, no longer a unified force, was a fractured collection of frightened, confused men. Some stared in horror at Silas's body. Others looked at their marshal with new, fearful eyes. "He killed Silas." The marshal shot him down. Someone yelled. Cain ignored them. His entire focus was narrowed to a single point of vindictive rage, the woman and the Apache who were about to unravel his empire of lies. He fired again, the bullet splintering the wooden frame of the barn door just inches from Sarah's head. "Finn, get them!" Cain bellowed at his deputy, who stood frozen near the well, his face a mask of shock. This was the moment of choosing for Finn Riley. He could obey the marshal, the man who held the star, or he could listen to the screaming voice of his own conscience. He saw the smoking gun in Cain's hand, the fallen body of the old prospector, and the desperate flight of Sarah and Nakai. He drew his own pistol. "Drop it, Marshal!" Finn shouted, his voice cracking, but resolute. "It's over." Cain laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "You pathetic whelp!" He turned his gun away from the fleeing pair and toward his own deputy. That moment of distraction was all Sarah needed. She grabbed Nakai's arm, pulling him along as he hobbled desperately on his crude crutch. The fire was spreading now, licking up the side of the barn with a hungry, crackling sound. Smoke began to billow into the night sky. This way Nakai grunted, pointing not toward the open plains, but back toward the small root cellar behind her house. It was their only conceivable shelter. As they scrambled behind the cottage out of the direct line of fire, Nakai stumbled, his injured leg giving way. He fell to one knee, his face contorted in agony. I cannot." He gasped the words, choked with pain and smoke. "Go, leave me. I'm not leaving you," Sarah said, her voice fierce. She tried to pull him up, but he resisted. "No, you must listen." He reached into his shirt again, past the knife, and his fingers closed around the beaded amulet she had noticed before. With a grunt of effort, he broke the leather thong and pressed it into her hand. It wasn't an amulet. It was a small, tightly folded pouch made of treated hide. This Nakai said, his dark eyes boring into hers, filled with a desperate urgency. "This is why he hunts me. Not for the family on the Verde. For this." Her fingers fumbled with the stiff pouch. Inside wasn't a map or a treaty. It was a small, leather-bound book no bigger than her palm. A physician's pocket ledger. The handwriting, though faint and smudged, was instantly, achingly familiar. It was Thomas's. Her breath caught in her chest. She flipped through the tiny pages, her heart pounding. It was a record written in her late husband's precise, scholarly hand. Dates, names, payments. But it was more than an account book. It was a diary of his secret life. For months before his death, Thomas had been slipping away from the ranch, not just to treat the townsfolk, but to provide medical care to a small, hidden community of Apache Nakai's people who had been driven into the hills by Kane's relentless campaigns. He documented everything the children he'd treated for whooping cough, the elders he'd given quinine for fever. But the last few entries told a different story. They were hurried, fearful. October 12th. Jedediah Kane visited the ranch today. He knows. He spoke of Indian lovers and traitors. His eyes, they hold a darkness I have not seen before. He is not just a lawman. He is a tyrant. October 19th. Nakai brought me word. Kane is using falsified government documents to seize land from homesteaders who won't sell. He blames the Apache for raids he orchestrates himself. He is clearing the valley for the railroad, and they are paying him a fortune. Silas Blackwood saw him near the old Miller place before it burned. Silas is terrified. Kane threatened his life. The final entry, dated the day before Thomas had taken to his bed for the last time, was the most chilling. October 25th. I have the proof. A letter from the railroad company to Kane detailing the entire scheme. Nakai's people intercepted the courier. It is Kane's undoing. I have hidden it. If something happens to me, Nakai knows where. He knows to find Sarah. He knows she has the heart of a lion. Sarah looked up from the ledger, her eyes blurred with tears. The story the world knew that her husband had died of consumption, a slow, tragic fading, was a lie. The timeline matched perfectly. The day after he wrote that final entry, his health had taken a sudden, catastrophic turn. Kane hadn't shot him. He had poisoned him. A slow, subtle poison that mimicked the symptoms of his disease, ensuring no one would ever suspect. Nakai hadn't stumbled upon her ranch by accident. He was fulfilling his final promise to her husband. He was bringing her the truth. He killed Thomas. She whispered the words, a bare exhalation of horror and understanding. Nakai nodded grimly. Kane found out about the ledger. He tortured one of our women until she spoke of it. He has been hunting me for it ever since. The killings at the Verde, it was to give him the excuse he needed to bring a full posse to sweep the land and find me. Suddenly a gunshot rang out from the front yard, followed by a cry of pain. It wasn't Kane's gun. It was Finn's. The entire dynamic of the night had been upended. The inferno consuming the barn was no longer the central drama. The real fire was the truth Sarah now held in her hands. It was a truth that exonerated Nakai, that condemned the marshal, and that finally terribly explained the real cause of her husband's death. Her personal grief and the public conflict had just merged into a single explosive revelation. She was no longer just protecting a fugitive. She was fighting for justice for the man she had loved. The cry of pain from the front yard galvanized Sarah. The truth in the ledger was a fire in her soul, burning away the last vestiges of her fear and grief, leaving only a core of cold, hard rage. Justice for Thomas. That was all that mattered now. "The cellar," she said to Nakai, her voice devoid of its earlier panic. "We need to get to the cellar." With a surge of adrenaline, she heaved Nakai's arm over her shoulder, taking on most of his weight. He gritted his teeth, hissing in pain, but he moved with her half-hopping, half-being, dragged toward the heavy wooden door set into the ground behind the house. The front yard was a scene of utter bedlam. Finn Riley was down clutching a bleeding shoulder, his pistol lying in the dust a few feet away. Marshal Kane stood over him, a triumphant demonic figure silhouetted against the blazing barn. The fire was a roaring beast, now consuming the structure with an insatiable hunger. Great plumes of flame and black smoke billowed into the star-filled sky, turning night into a terrifying, flickering day. The posse was in disarray. Some men were trying to get their spooked horses under control. Others, horrified by Kane's brazen violence, were backing away. Their loyalty shattered. A brave few were starting to move toward their fallen deputy. "Anyone else feel lucky?" Kane bellowed, swinging his pistol around to cover the hesitant men. "I am the law here, and the law says that man," he gestured with his gun toward the burning barn, "was a murderer, and this woman is his accomplice." He was losing control, but he was too far gone to see it. He was a king whose castle was burning down around him. Sarah and Nakai reached the cellar door. It was heavy, made of thick oak. She wrenched at the iron handle. It was swollen shut, the wood warped by years of sun and rain. "It's stuck," she cried, pulling with all her might. From the front of the house, Kane saw them. "There!" he roared, and he started toward them, his long legs eating up the distance. Nakai released his hold on Sarah. "Hold this," he commanded, pressing Thomas's ledger back into her hands. He then took the long wooden plank he had been using as a crutch, holding it like a battering ram, and with a guttural war cry that seemed to rip from the very depths of his soul, he slammed the end of the plank against the edge of the cellar door. The wood groaned. He hit it again, and again. On the third strike, there was a loud crack and the door shuddered loose from its frame. Sarah threw it open, revealing a black, earthy-smelling hole. Kane was closing in his face, a mask of fury. He raised his pistol to take aim, but just as he was about to fire, a shot rang out, not from his gun. Kane cried out, and stumbled not from a bullet, but from the impact of a rock that had struck him squarely in the back of the head. Sarah looked up to see a small cluster of the possemen, the ones who had been moving to help Finn. One of them, a burly blacksmith named Jebediah Smith, stood with his arm still outstretched, another rock in his hand. "He ain't the law," Jebediah yelled. "He's a murderer and a land thief." The spell was broken. Kane was no longer a marshal. He was just a man, a killer, who had turned on his own. The distraction gave them the second they needed. "Go!" Nakai yelled, pushing Sarah toward the opening. She scrambled down the rickety ladder into the cool, damp darkness. Nakai turned his knife in hand to face the enraged marshal. Kane, shaking his head to clear it, saw Nakai standing before him, a wounded, defiant warrior guarding the gateway to his last secret. Cain fired wildly. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Nakai's shoulder, spinning him around. He fell backward, tumbling down the cellar steps, to land in a heap at Sarah's feet. Cain staggered to the opening, his face bloody from the rock, his eyes wild. He peered down into the darkness, raising his gun. "I'll kill you both," he screamed. "I'll burn you out." Before he could fire, the men led by Jebediah and a now recovering Finn swarmed him. There was a desperate grunting struggle. A final gunshot echoed, but it wasn't aimed at the cellar. The fight ended as quickly as it began. Silence descended, broken only by the roar and crackle of the burning barn. Sarah, her heart hammering, crawled to Nakai. He was alive, but barely. The new bullet wound was bleeding profusely. "Did we?" he whispered, his breath shallow. "We did," she said, her hand clutching the ledger. "We did, Nakai." Slowly, cautiously, she climbed the ladder and peered out. The scene was surreal. Her barn, the last major structure Thomas had built, was collapsing in on itself, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the air. Marshal Cain lay on the ground, unmoving, his own pistol lying beside him. Finn, Jebediah, and the other men stood around, looking dazed, their faces lit by the dying flames. The fire had drawn them there. It had been intended as an instrument of terror and destruction, a funeral pyre for a secret. But instead, it had become a beacon. It had illuminated the truth, forged new alliances in its heat, and consumed the lies that had held Harmony Creek in a grip of fear. Sarah stood amidst the ruins of her old life, the smoke stinging her eyes, her husband's ledger clutched in her hand. She had lost her home. She had lost her peace. But in the ashes, something new had been found, justice. The storm had passed, leaving a devastating, cleansing calm in its wake. The sunrise that followed was pale and tentative, as if hesitant to cast its light upon the wreckage of the night. The great fire had consumed itself, leaving the smouldering, blackened skeleton of the barn to scar the landscape, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt wood and shattered lies, was unnaturally still. Marshal Jebediah Cain was dead. In the final desperate struggle, his own gun had gone off, putting a swift and brutal end to his reign of terror. It was a fittingly violent end for a violent man. His body, along with that of the gentle, brave Silas Blackwood, had been taken back to Harmony Creek on a makeshift litter, a somber procession of riders whose faces were etched with shame and grim understanding. Finn Riley, his arm bandaged and his youthful face aged by a decade in a single night, had been the one to take charge. Before they left, he had come to Sarah, his hat in his hands. Mrs. Carter, he'd said, his voice heavy with the weight of it all. "This ledger." He nodded toward the small book she still held. "It will change everything. It'll clear your husband's name. It'll give back the land Cain stole. You've saved this town from a cancer." Sarah had only nodded, too exhausted for words. She and Finn had carried Nakai into the house, into the very bedroom where Thomas had died. She spent the long, quiet hours of the dawn tending to him. The new wound was clean, the bullet having passed straight through, but he had lost too much blood. His strength was fading, the fever returning with a vengeance. The fire in his eyes, once a defiant blaze, was now a flickering ember. He was lucid, though his voice a dry whisper against the pillow. He told her of Thomas's kindness, of the risks he took to bring medicine to the Apache camp. He spoke of him not as a doctor, but as a brother, He told me. If the darkness came for him, Nakai whispered, his gaze distant, that I should find the woman with the heart of a lion. He said you would know what to do with the truth. He coughed a weak, rattling sound. He was right. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Sarah's cheek. Rest, Nakai. You need to rest. You're safe now. A faint smile touched his cracked lips. My fight is over. My promise is kept. His eyes fluttered closed, and his breathing grew shallow, then softer, until it was no more. Sarah sat with him in the quiet room as the morning light filled the windows, her hand resting on his still one. She felt no horror, no fear, only a profound, aching sadness and a boundless sense of gratitude. He had died not as a renegade hunted in the dust, but as a hero, a keeper of promises in a warm bed watched over by a friend. It was the best she could give him. Later that day, she buried him on the small rise behind the house next to Thomas. Two men of different worlds united in their belief in a common decency, now resting under the same unforgiving sky. There was no marker, save for a small pile of stones. His name and his story would be hers to carry. In the week that followed, Finn Riley returned several times. The ledger had, as he predicted, torn Harmony Creek apart and then begun to stitch it back together. The men Kane had deputized confirmed the story. The railroad company, faced with a federal investigation, admitted to the bribery. The land was returned. The name of Dr. Thomas Carter was cleared, his quiet compassion finally understood. But Sarah could not stay. The ranch was a graveyard of memories, both beautiful and brutal. Every corner held a ghost. It was no longer her home. She packed a single bag, taking with her only the clothes on her back, her Colt Peacemaker, and the small leather-bound ledger. She sold the land and the goat to a young family that Finn recommended. A family with bright, hopeful eyes who deserved a fresh start. On her last day, she stood on the porch looking out at the plains. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of sage and dust. She was no longer the timid, grieving widow who had been startled by a noise in the cottonwoods. That woman was gone, burned away in the fires of that terrible transformative night. In her place was a woman who had looked into the face of savagery and had not flinched. A woman who had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of doing what was right in spite of it. The heart of a lion, Thomas had called it. She finally understood. She didn't know where she was going. West, maybe. Somewhere the sky was bigger. Somewhere she could build a new life, not on the ashes of the old one, but with the strength she had forged within them. She was alone, but for the first time in a long time she was not lonely. She had the truth as her companion, and a future that was for the first time entirely her own. That night in the Arizona dust wasn't just the end of a corrupt marshal or the burning of a barn. It was the birth of a legend. Sarah Carter's story reminds us that the deepest held prejudices can be shattered by a single act of compassion. And the true strength isn't found in the power you hold over others, but in the courage to stand for what's right, even when you're standing alone. It's a story of how one quiet voice can rise above the roar of a mob and change the course of history. If Sarah's fight for justice stirred something in you, then help us keep these stories of the raw, untamed West alive. Please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of what courage looks like. And be sure to subscribe for more tales of heroes, villains, and the unwritten legends of the frontier.